Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into some seriously fascinating and highly debated source material that takes a hard look at the very foundations of one of the world's biggest religions. The source we're unpacking makes a pretty bold claim that the origins of Christianity weren't born from objective history, but were actually pieced together from retrofitted texts, mistranslations, and some incredibly calculated political maneuvering. It's a huge premise, right? And just as a quick reminder, our goal here isn't to take a side or tell you what to believe. We're simply here to impartially break down exactly what this source is arguing and how it builds its case. So, let's get right into it.
To tackle this, we've organized the source's claims into 4 chronological themes: constructing the origins, a historical void, the evolving story, and finally, the imperial shift.
Starting off with Section 1, constructing the origins, fulfilling prophecy retroactively.
The source kicks things off with a major central thesis. It argues that early writers essentially bent historical facts to make sure the character of Jesus perfectly fit the mold of pre-existing Jewish messianic prophecies. Basically, the claim is that the story was reverse-engineered. The source opens with this really stark historical conflict. You've got the familiar gospel narratives where Joseph and Mary travel all the way to Bethlehem for a Roman census. But according to the source, Roman historical records show absolutely no precedent for this. The Romans taxed you where you actually lived, not where your ancestors lived 1,000 years ago. So why put that detail in the text? Well, the source claims Matthew and Luke fabricated these conflicting travel routes just to align with a prophecy in the book of Micah, which specifically said the Messiah would come from Bethlehem. And the source makes a point of noting that this whole Bethlehem detail is completely missing from Mark and Paul's much earlier writings.
And this retrofitting supposedly extends to the genealogies too. Matthew traces Jesus' lineage down through Solomon, while Luke traces it through Nathan. The source argues these are 2 totally different, wildly contradictory bloodlines, yet both claim to belong to Joseph. But here's the massive logical paradox the source zeroes in on. Think about it. If the virgin birth is true, Joseph's royal Davidic bloodline is biologically meaningless. You literally can't inherit a crown through a man who isn't your biological father. The source suggests early writers spent a ton of effort building up this complex legal argument around a miracle that, by its very nature, made those exact legal arguments totally irrelevant.
Which leads us right into what the source calls its most pivotal claim of all. The argument here is that the virgin birth itself actually stems from a simple, honest translation error. In the original Hebrew text of Isaiah, the word used was alma, which just translates to young woman. But when that Hebrew Bible was later translated into Greek, that specific word was mistakenly swapped out for parthenos, which specifically means virgin. The source argues that this one single mistaken word, a literal linguistic accident, somehow became the absolute foundation for Christianity's most defining doctrine. It even points out that the earliest gospel, Mark, never mentions a virgin birth at all because, according to the source's timeline, the concept just hadn't been invented yet.
Moving on to Section 2, a historical void, the silence of the first century.
Now, the source zooms out from the text to look at the broader historical environment of the time, and it arrives at a pretty startling number: 0. That is the exact number of contemporary Roman, Greek, or Jewish writers who actually documented this miracle-performing, crowd-drawing figure during his actual lifetime. The source heavily emphasizes that first-century Palestine was a really well-documented place. We have surviving records from multiple authorities detailing minor political prisoners and totally obscure peasant uprisings. Yet the source claims there is 0 contemporary footprint for a man who supposedly fed thousands and raised the dead right out in the open.
But you might be asking, what about the witnesses, right? Because in any historical investigation, independent confirmation is absolutely crucial. Well, the source points to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, written around the year 55, where Paul claims over 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus. The source critiques this pretty heavily, calling it a phantom crowd. It points out that this is a massive claim, yet it completely lacks names, dates, specific locations, and, most importantly, any independent confirmation in the later Gospels. The source's argument is that Paul, who never actually met Jesus in life and formed his views through visions, might have simply invented this giant crowd to artificially boost the credibility of the early religion he was working so hard to build. Which brings us to Section 3, the evolving story, anonymous authors and mythological inflation.
If we trace this literary evolution chronologically, we obviously start at year 0 with the alleged events themselves. But then we jump a full 40 years later to when the earliest Gospels were actually penned. And the source stresses a really critical detail here. They were written completely anonymously. The famous names we know today, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were actually added decades later by church tradition.
Then, stretching all the way up to 70 years after the events, later Gospels are still being written, and they're adding these massive, heavy layers of theological expansions. The source uses this huge generational gap to argue that what we're looking at isn't a set of first-hand eyewitness accounts, but rather decades of reshaping, oral retelling, and intense theological refinement.
And this leads into a concept the source calls mythological inflation. Basically, the character of Jesus doesn't just stay static. He evolves step by step over time. In Mark, the earliest text, Jesus is portrayed mostly as a humble, apocalyptic preacher. But decades later, Matthew and Luke arrive on the scene, and suddenly we have miraculous origin stories and the virgin birth. Finally, by the time we get to John, which was the very last gospel written, the portrayal has shifted dramatically to this pre-existing cosmic deity walking among men. The source argues this is a clear, undeniable literary evolution, where the figure grows grander and way more divine with every passing generation.
You can even see this evolution applied directly to the resurrection itself. Mark's original ending wraps up super simply. Women discover an empty tomb and flee in silent fear. That's it. No resurrection appearances, no dramatic post-death miracles. But the later texts, they paint a very different picture. Scribes and later gospel writers start adding heavily guarded tombs, incredibly dramatic encounters on the road to Emmaus, and a doubting Thomas physically touching resurrected wounds. The source contends that the physical resurrection wasn't an actual historical event at all, but rather a theological idea that was retroactively forced into the texts because the growing religion desperately needed a powerful, validating climax.
To further drive home the argument that these are works of theological propaganda rather than eyewitness history, the source points out some major timeline-breaking contradictions in the Passion narratives. For example, Matthew claims Judas hung himself, but the book of Acts says he fell and burst open. One gospel insists both thieves on the cross mocked Jesus, while another claims one famously repented. John states the crucifixion happened the day before Passover, but the others adamantly say it was on Passover itself. The source argues that true, first-hand eyewitnesses just wouldn't fundamentally disagree on something as major as the actual day their teacher died. It suggests these are entirely distinct narratives crafted by anonymous authors who are trying to make vastly different theological points.
And that exact same logic extends to the foundational stories of the early martyrs. The source doesn't mince words here, stating, most martyrdom narratives were written long after the events they describe. It is the most powerful tool of manipulation. It asserts that these incredibly dramatic, faith-affirming tales, like Peter actively choosing to be crucified upside down, have absolutely no contemporary record. They stem entirely from apocryphal texts written over a century later. The argument is that these heroic narratives were essentially fabricated to insulate the growing religion. By holding up these martyrs, any internal doubt within the community would suddenly feel like treason against the very heroes who supposedly bled for the cause.
Finally, let's look at Section 4, the imperial shift, from grassroots to global empire.
So how exactly did this highly debated, kind of fragmented narrative transform from a marginalized grassroots movement into something that dominated a global empire? Well, the source boils this massive historical pivot down to pure, unadulterated political strategy. Back in the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine was facing a severe crisis. He had a fractured empire on the edge of total collapse, traditional paganism was completely failing to unify the citizens, and he desperately needed tight administrative control. Enter Christianity. It offered the perfect ready-made solution. It provided the promise of eternal order, a singular central narrative with absolute moral authority, and, maybe most importantly, a highly useful pre-existing network of obedient bishops. The source argues Constantine adopted the cross strictly out of strategic imperial necessity to hold millions of people together, not because of some genuine spiritual awakening. This strategic alliance ultimately culminated at the famous Council of Nicaea. This council aggressively standardized the doctrine through sheer imperial power behind the favored bishops and, to use the source's provocative phrasing, replaced the Jesus of love with the Christ of conquest. The source outlines a really profound transformation here. Christianity basically ceased being a localized movement for the poor and oppressed and officially transformed into a highly structured, top-down mechanism used by emperors to maintain absolute earthly control. Which leaves us with a really profound question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer of the source material. Were these simply the efforts of ancient storytellers retrofitting theology into the mold of Jewish messianic expectation? Regardless of your personal beliefs, this source material really pushes us to step back and examine the immense scale of how history, mythology, and political power intertwine. It forces us to ask how stories are built, how they evolve across generations, and ultimately how they manage to survive and shape entire human empires. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.